Ok. Siendo las 15:05 según mi reloj.
Okay. In my time at 15:05, we start our session today, giving all our attendees a short intro before we start with today's speaker, Marcelo. I am Carlos Núñez, a technical regional coordinator of LACPASS and sub-director of the health system sense. Today, we have a third session of our training cycle with the repository as we had it. A short reminder is that this is a cycle contained within the work of the initiatives that we have with PAHO, with the BEAD, LACPASS, and this project, DCC. And the idea is that all the cycles that we have been putting together from one or the other project can cover the whole region. And that's why we have people from LACPASS, PAHO, DCC, although more and more of the countries are adhering to the list, some work in some teams and others in others. So before anything, I want to share this slide with you to look forward to the year to come and what we are coordinating along with BEAD and PAHO, what we want to do next year in a second Connect-a-thon, where we are putting together 3 tracks for a second Connect-a-thon that has to do with the summary of patients. And this is one we're going to work with a lot in LACPASS, about to work with the developments, certainly to start with each country in the sharing of these enablers and the work of what is a summary of international patient. And also we have the DCC track that we're working directly with in this training cycles. And the idea is that we can be able to replicate by mid next year this Connect-a-thon with the certificates issuance based on DCC standards, which is another track we've identified. And it's understood as required. And we're also working on the definitions to do the extension of the vaccination certificates with the understanding that DCC is only for COVID. So we want to see if there's a way to adapt that one and extend it, or if we can have from the IPS the data linked to yet other vaccinations like yellow fever, for instance, which is one of those that are yet to define. But I like to mention it so that we understand where are we going to with the issuing of certificate and the interoperability among countries. Without further ado, and seeing that we have more people joining us, I leave Marcelo Cabello with you to explain to you what we're going to do today. Thank you, Carlos.
Bien, muy buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everybody. And welcome to this session where we'll check the integration with the FHIR server to be able to use it in tests concerning the digital certificate testing. Once again, I am Marcelo Cabello, as you know. I'm an engineer at the National Center of Healthcare Systems, and I am part of the HL7 committee. And I've been trained in Germany with project administration in IT, and my training is medical IT, working with hospitals, primary care institutions, etc. I'm going to shut my camera off because I don't have a very good connection, and then I'm going to start with today's chat. And today's objective during this practice is We're going to have this session so you know what the installation process is all about and the enabler and use of an HL7 file server in your data repository, which is going to serve as well as an environment, as a test environment and in it for the DDCC documents and the status of vaccination, also with some very easy interactions with the repository, with the purpose to understand a little bit how the dynamic works between the entity that works with the repository, both for the storage as for the consumption of this information. So in this presentation, we'll cover the installation guide and the practical demonstration, which is taking us some time, also basic operations in fire and some resources that may be of interest. And we believe it's very interesting so that you can learn about them. As a third point, we'll see the repository services and the existing registry they already have in the implementation guideline. And in the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. So starting there with the basic installation of a fire server, we've chosen a distribution, which is API Fire Server, which is an open code server, which also is very easy to use and brings a lot of stuff already built in so that you can add them without further challenges. And to make it easier, we've installed a very simple document, which is an installation guide based on the Worker Compose service. So there are some previous requirements, and it is to have the Docker already installed, and then you can also install the server within 5 to 10 minutes if you have it already, if you have the Docker. The link is in this presentation, but also maybe one of my colleagues could share the link to the guide in the chat, and you have the pathway to do the installation from the Docker Compose service. And there is a chapter there if you require for a more ad hoc installation, which is done through the source code. You do the changes, the additions to the source code of the service, you compile it, and then you execute the server with the requirements. But since this is a very basic, we're going to go to the first part. And the very easy steps will be to first check the previous requirements. And I'll tell you with this, if this is going to be a simple test, an online idea, or if it's a local machine, there's going to need to be at least 4 RAM, as minimum 4 megas of RAM. And certainly with production settings, that's something that can increase according to the requirements that you have in the amount of access or requirements of access the server has. Once these objectives have been met, and also the installation of the Docker service, comes the Docker Compose service installation, and then next there's the creation of 2 files. The first one is of a setting variables, and the second one is a Docker Compose file, which I've copied from the guide. And I'm now going to switch to a virtual sample I have prepared. And so first is to define some setting variables, because and by good practice is to leave it in an env file. And these are only 2, a credential for a Postgre database as the user and the password of Postgre. And I want to highlight here that the server we're going to install here is based on a Postgres database without any problem. And if you define to use another database, you could certainly use it by making a change in the configuration. And the other file is from a Docker compose .eml, and I'll show you the structure. And the YML will be the file. This is a Docker container file where we have an internal network, the volumes, and then you state the services that you will use. And since I told you you'd use a database, then I state the database service based on a Postgres 11 with an Alpine system. And so here is where you transfer like the variables, the data that I had generated in the prior file in the env, and the .env one. The second will be the file server, which we have based on a specific image, which is the version 6.1.0. We've also stated it within the same subnetwork of containers. And what you have to be careful with here is if you're going to make any changes in the search engine, will be this surrounding information. Like if you had a Oracle, Postgres, or another search engine directly, what you have to do is you change it in the screen data source that URL in parallel, which it's going to be the one for the database, and then state the driver class name linked to that database, and then also the dialect linked to be able to work with it so that the Happy Fire can work internally and just fine with the dialect engine. And just as to not forget it, you expose the server's ports, which in this particular, these two ports are one that goes to the internal part of the server, and the other is to the external machine you'll be working the access with. With this, you save that info, and then you can work with a simple verification to know if you have configured this file correctly. And with the Docker compose config command, you can see the file that has been configured properly. And with that, we're ready to execute the service. How can we execute the service? Simple. You do it with the Docker compose over there, and then -D. That does not rely on the screen, since it is the first time we're going to execute it. I'll do it. Since the first time we're going to execute the service, what it's going to happen is it'll do a pulling or the extraction of information of those images within the repository, the public repository, that is. This is quite fast. When it downloads the image of the Postgres
del servidor Happy Fire. Y una vez que hace la
engine,
descarga,
and then next, what it would do is the downloading and the memories. And I can prove that with the Docker PS -A to see what are the containers that are currently running. And then, since it's the first time we implement the service, it may take a while in the Happy Fire servers to be able to process the whole creating of the database until it's operative. Check it here. And what I see here is the doc of the Happy Fire server, because the internet task being done, it has to check the service, the database, expose checkpoints, and a couple minutes after, it will be ready. We're going to give it a moment While it works, I'll go back to the presentation. So we've gone through the creating of a Docker Compose file with the option on it was necessary to modify the file or not, and we've launched the service for the first time. Also, there are certain modifiers to start or stop the service. I've shown you, but what I want to see now is the verification of the performance of the server. Here we see it running. And as you can see, there are two ways, I think, very dynamic to prove whether the server is working. The first one is from the machines console, where you can work with the curl command. And that curl command, you bring it to localhost 8080. As you remember, we had exposed the server that way. And here I'm going to go to the root of patient. I forgot to write this. You have to write get. And what we obtain as a response is a banner of the search set type. So what's trying to do is bring back to the server with a list of patient resources. It's a bundle type of resource. So that's like a quick way to prove the functioning of the service. And if you're not in the line of the console at hand, then you can access the server. I have it in this URL. It's already running in the port 8080. And so what I'm doing with this is, I'm sorry, I'm going to the graphic interface of the Fire server user. I see version 6.1. And also to find out extra information, such as the metadata of the service, the capability statement of the metadata, according to current server's capacity. You do it taking the route toward the metadata expression. And so what you see is the overview of the server's capacity for each resource and the operations linked to each resource. In terms of the server capacity, we're going to check here. It's 6.0. And the implementation is the Happy Fire server in the network 4 with the version 4.0.1 in Fire. Everything down there will be information about resources and the capacities of each resource to be able to work on those. So we have the server running. And this part here, I'm not going to delve much into, is the one I told you. If you decide to perform changes, specific changes into the server to sort of alter its behavior, then you can download the source code from the Happy Fire page in the GitHub. And you can, for that, you need Java JDK17 in your equipment, and it may even more equal to 3.6 version. So you'll do pretty good. So you download the GitHub source code. You see the servers that already have their version.
Se descomprime ese código.
You try and find the 6.1 version, decompress it in the local equipment. There are certain commands that are to do code compilation, which is rather quick. You can execute the server, and to verify the performance, you just follow steps I explained before, either through the console with the curl command or by access to the IP address of the server. There are safety considerations that the security considerations to look into. I had been asked before on how to secure the server, and so that question requires this explanation. What happens is Fire is an API REST itself. So it exposes the point and the way how to interact with it. So security is not included in this level. It's not a part of this layer. And so these need to be solved at another level above the server. Obviously, if HL7 Fire makes certain security and privacy recommendations according to the access, that's going to be there. And also about the traces done within the server as you access, modify, or consume the resources. So there are elements of consent, auditing, designing, etc. But what you have to have very clear here is that FHIR is not a security protocol, nor defines a functionality concerning that. It's just an API that offers mechanisms to expose and operate the defined resources. Some simple operations with FHIR. Basically, and in this link,
de las operaciones, pero básicamente son un conjunto de interacciones definidas en esta API, ¿ya?
With the definition in this API, there are interactions under the RESTful paradigm, which is equivalent to CRU, which is create, read, update, and delete, the CRUD of resources. All of them translated into certain verbs you are going to work with during the interaction with them. There will be the get, post, put, delete, and patch lately. Also, when the presentation is unable to satisfy according to this paradigm or to suffice the data management, there are other functions defined, which are the operations working under the RPC paradigm, the remote procedure, and I forgot what is C stand for. I think it's remote procedure code. And here it is saying that when there are specific actions required, you can call that operation and generate a certain behavior in the server. Here, the implementation guide, in this case, the DCC needs to go to the questionnaire response resource that has an operation called generate health certificate. So it's an internal operation being done, grabbing the data, and that data is the one you transform. Both kinds of call respond with HTTP codes 200 when the operation is properly executed, 201 when the resource has been created. And there are also error codes when the operation or the interaction has not been quite solved. Therefore, in the server, we can create a patient. We can do something very easy here so that you can access other more complex resources. What I have here on the left is the data entry that is based in the patient's information. So there are certain attributes, an ID, an active, a name, a gender, and a birth date. And this is like the data of what we need to register in the server done through a post, which creates a patient resource within the server. So what we see there is what the server is answering, and it's responding with a 201 created code, and the resource, different to the original, now contains a metadata and the version, the resource, the last updating date, the text, but then the data goes directly to the server without any problems. But the difference that here's an ID with the value 1 instead of example on the left, because in this particular case, post operations in the server, what the server does is a default number. There is a way to actually enter a particular one if you want, but that's done with a different HTTP part. In the case of put, what it does is it updates an existing resource. And so you call the put the resource, and I'm sorry here, I don't want to confuse you. Here you do it versus the ID of that resource. And so I could have to make a change in a resource. And so then I, for instance, want to add an extra name. And I do put on the patient, and what ends up happening here is the resource with ID 1 changes its metadata. And so the version of the resource changes, and there's a change in the content. To inquire, you do it through the get method, calling the resource, patient in this case, to the specification, and then after that, you indicate the resource ID number, which should call back the given resource. And there are certainly other ways to acquire these resources with some other sets of criteria, which are called search parameters. And each resource brings a certain limited portion of resource of information. And so with that, you can build up and for it to respond to your needs. Lastly, to delete a resource, you use the word delete. You call the resource, in this case, patient, and then its ID and what it'll offer different to others, to other outputs. You'll see and the type of resource, operation outcome, which delivers the information, as in this case, it says that it was successful. And just to remind you, this part in the delete part is logical. So you need to look into other resources to understand them. There are many others in the guide of the implementation, but I took this one that's a little bigger because it's like a source of container. We are going to talk about 3 of those resources. The first one is bundle, which is used to contain a collection of resources. So within a bank, I have a resource called patient, another called practitioner, another one of the type of the of any of the types the specification has available. And what are the bundle resources used for? Well, they have different purposes depending on the type or the way you enable it. When used for search, for instance, is when I'm connecting with a server and I do get and then patient, and it gives me the whole list of patients. And now those patient resources come in a search bundle, and it also helps to read editorials of the resource, also for messaging. And this and the bold are for documents and sections and storage. And so when we create a bundle resource toward the service, toward the server root, you will usually use the transaction or batch type. The transaction, it records or stores everything. And if there is an error, it does not save anything. And the batch is the batching process. When this happens, the server's root separates the resources and saves them on their given endpoints. So if there was a patient there as a transaction or batch, it would be saved into the endpoint of that patient part. And it's different when the bundle is intended toward the bundle endpoint. And at that time, we use one of the document type, and what it does is that the resources saved in the bundle endpoint are all kept like in a package. It's like a full box. And as a first resource, within that composition, a composition resource needs to go in, which has some other metadata according to others that are included. There's also the composition source that we had also linked to bundle earlier. And what composition does is it brings a group of information related to the health assistance, put all together as a single logic package that is going to provide a coherent meaning statement because the very package establishes its own context. And it has extra data like clinical statement according to who is making the declaration. And also there is an editing that defines the structure and the narrative content. Also in the composition guide, we're going to see the composition operation. It's going to be composition, its ID, and the document. When you just read a composition alone by the ID, it's just going to take you to the metadata that was linked to that composition, but it's not going to generate all the documents that are put together in this logic model. But when you call the operation composition ID document in this particular, what FHIR does is it scans the composition to try and find what are the other resources that are embedded in it to generate a full package. It's going to be the composition plus the other resources to be able to show them as a whole. So important that you don't forget that, because that's going to be considered in the implementation guide. And also not least important, but it is, although it's not a packing document, it's a reference document that establishes a reference to documents of any sort in a MIMI classification. It could be an X-ray, a PDF file, other resources, etc. And so what it does, this document reference, is to provide metadata to the document being pointed at so that it can be searched and worked with in a way. As I told you, the idea is that any document under a MIMI kind of work, it'll include formal documents as CDA, clinical notes, scanned documents, and other non-specific to the patient. Now, concerning repository and registry services, for the DDCC guide, we can sort of freshen up our memory on that. The DDCC is the certificate generation workflow as it appears in the guide. And the green arrows are about the calls that have to do with the document repository. It also refers to a service registry, which saves references to that repository. And we'll see a little bit of how is the relationship between them later on. So the first arrow we see here is for the creation of a DDCC document. After that, the storage of the DDCC document, and also the registration of the certificate itself concerning the transactions of the profile, HD, HTML. And we also have some calls to inquire or to recover information from the certificate or certificates. That will be the next workflow and the continuity of care. And then I've tried to simplify this a lot to be able to understand it, all right? Sorry. So, as you may remember, the service is triggered when the user looks for a request, which is basically a bundle that contains a question response inside, and sends it to the document generation service. This service will receive the document and perform a series of transformations that will finally end up in a response of the submit health, which is a bundle, a questionnaire bundle that has a DDCC document with the signature inside. So what we do here is that the generation service is the one interacting with the repository and with the registration. It's important to highlight here that the registry and the repository can work by separate, or they can be in a single file server. For the purpose of this presentation, we've decided to put it in a single server in order to simplify the interaction and the effects that would produce. On the other hand, we had the store health, the repository service. After the generation service receives the questionnaire and does the transformation, it generates a transaction type bundle. And inside is, as I said, a bundle of document type that needs first a composition resource. And then inside those, we have the resource of patient, document reference, immunization recommendation, organization, and also certain extra information inside, like HACIB. And here's where we have the signature of the document.
Quería decir algo, pero
I wanted to say something, but I forgot. I'll try to remember. So in the case that in our reviews, we've opted it to store the resources by separate, as I explained earlier in the bundle, to then take them back and put them into a single transaction. And that single transaction, let me show you, is then what happens next. Because what we're doing here is we are storing the certificate in the repository. And to access to it, then we're going to support ourselves on the register service, which needs to fulfill a certain standards of the DHML, HML. Once is 5 called provide document bundle, which takes the references that are in the repository
de tipo transaction,
and then express them in this transaction type of bundle. And this transaction bundle is one that saves everything or saves nothing, different to the document bundle. And this transaction, according to the EHL, defines a submission set resource and others such as document reference, binary reference, folder, and patient. And what's in parentheses is the actual name of a resource taken to the file presentation. And what this transaction saves are multiple references between both the resources, between all resources, in order to identify well what are their contents, and also to define a reference toward the repository where one of these bundles will be located containing the certificate. So there are internal things, like for a folder, this is the resource that considers the vaccination events, both current as former, and it also keeps reference of the patient resource, which is one based on the profile of the DDCC guides. So that resource can be used to store the references. And it also has a link to a document reference, which is internal. And what it does is when we get here, it tells me that this bundle is in the repository. With that same idea, binary reference offers us a document reference as well and a metadata to be able to make a reference to a binary resource, which is one that in this case we've linked to a PDF. We've not worked with that completely, but we do have it there, and we're going to consider it to be in consistency with the guide. And the document reference, which, as you know, has the reference to the bundle and to the patient. And then the submission set, which has the other references so that we can understand well, is conceived as the receiving of invoices and the shipment of a package, so we can understand it easy. And for the recovery of certificates, 3 transactions are provided. And I suggest you read them from right to left, where the first one is going to be the Retrieve Health folder, which it works with the recovery of vaccination certificates. And this call communicates with the registry service and it recovers the vaccination history. So it's going to work with the list resource, which is of the folder type, as we saw it in the prior slide. So, I'm sorry. Then it's going to recover a whole group of document references with vaccination information. And so with that, we can help ourselves with the transactions part to recover the vaccination event that is being mentioned. And the way we have found it, we've gotten to it by go to File Resource List, and you add the modifier code with the folder and the identifier of HECIB. Another call could be IT68. So once we've been able to establish and recover the vaccination folder, we're going to be able to check that result and then call IT68, and with it, recovering the information of a specific vaccination registration. So that's an alt event. And the third, so a little bit more complicated, and I'm not going to delve into it too much, will be IT67, which retrieves a reference. But this transaction in particular operates over document reference type of documents. And so what it happens, it's actually hard to recover data from references. So we just left it there so that you understand that it's there. But so far, we're still studying about it to see how to execute it. What we do have is that it can be produced upon IT66 or IT68, like indirectly, calling it indirectly, not with a direct transaction, because it's going to come up with many sets of search or filter criteria, making it very hard to recover. And so that has been today's presentation. We've gone through the simple installation of a Fire service with Docker Compose. We've gone through the basic operations of Fire, plus 3 useful resources that are linked to the DDCC guide implementation. And we've seen the interactions that occur from and to the repository of DCC and its pair, the registry service one. So without any further ado, I open the floor for questions or comments or suggestions. Thank you.
Hola, buenas tardes, Fernando.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Fernando. Just to say that the presentation has been excellent and really nothing to add. Just that as we saw, and Alejandro had said some about it last week, is that HMD is the base profile or what it comes after those that had already been familiar with DS, which is the same profile for clinical medical records project as well. And so we see the applications here for DDCC. And so it's very interesting. And it's like one of those things that have to do with public property and working with PAHO. The idea is that we could at some point, we could use this exercise to make the interoperability probably with an IPS or another kind of document. This one is more intended to the certificate, which is the current purpose. But as we saw, and it can be in another kind of document, and the advantage to advance in this exercise is that we're going to go with the standard operations for the interoperativity projects at a country level. And so it's giving us a very good possibility for national projects. So it's really important with the installations and check the transactions, and those that are working with DDCC to do the conversion and the generation of this certificate. But this is also giving us the knowledge and capability for the countries to start storing and having an XDS structure to start working with fire, as very nicely explained today and last week with Alejandro, the HMDL transaction. So it's not just about the relevance of this learning and experiences of today, which is really going to be beneficial. But also to share with you that here in Colombia, we checked this profile bit as well. And a couple of structures were not used. I think it was list that we said last week, but certainly we need to go toward what is being proposed by you right now. Very good. Thank you, Fernando, for your comment. So I don't see specific questions in the chat, but according to, but about the documentation, there is a link to download the installation guide of a fire server. So of course, if you have any questions, we're going to be always here to help you solve any questions you may have about the installation. Okay. We didn't explain too much, we didn't delve so much in the interaction with the repository, because we know that not everybody has knowledge in fire. So we've tried to be very simple about the presentation of the interaction with the repository. And so we hope that this helps you so that you can do the first interactions with the server in your trials and the tests, so you can start getting used to this kind of transactions. Any more questions? Otherwise, I think we can finish today's session. Just to give you some additional information to remind you that the Excel page in the resources is available to see today's presentation. You can see it, and the Spanish video of this session as well, as we recover this part of this material that is in the courses part of the site. If you have any questions on how to access to that website, just let us know. But you see the link over there. Anybody can access to this cycle of courses without having an account, making it easier for you. And the video is also being there. And the LACPASS channel is going to be there as well, with this and other materials that can be needed in some other projects. And to see the sessions, I'm going to share the link here in the chat. You can see the link for the courses session, and you can enter as guests to explore the whole first cycle already on it, and the second cycle will be loading it as we generate the sessions. And the YouTube channel, give me 30 seconds. I think I have it handy. Here it is. Let me see. So here's the link. That's the videos there. The Rexels is good because it also brings other additional material, like the link to the documentation we're sharing here. There is a question here, I think, Marcelo. It says, for the configuration of fire in a production setting, what will be the minimum requirement to be considered? Well, the question is probably too open because it depends on the kind of requirement. Depends also a little on what is your case of use and what are you going to require later on. So you can have a certain features, equipment for the server, but if you also have conditions of like of response with fire tolerance, you can also think of that to cover the fire solution from another hardware techniques as well and infrastructure. So to like make it easier when we have started working with
Levantado por lo menos con un servidor con 8 GB de RAM.
worked with like with the one that has a 4 cores, so and the bit of requires or access or demands to the server. It could work rather good, but otherwise it is advisable to have a stress test to your infrastructure, to run that stress test before, so that you can identify and make sure that your solution is not going to come short in terms of resources. It is important to remind you that the structure and these ones have to do with text. There are considerations for production settings for these particular initial implementation phase that for the learning are not as demanding. Something that we could also check with the technical teams of each country. And I think Mauricio Figueroa raised his hand. There was a question on whether the database needed to be managed as a container, and no, it's not necessary. It could be even external. It all depends on the case of use, but if they're in the cloud, you could certainly use it for a service with the configuration that Marcelo said that allows to configure the internal database. So it's all up to the kind of use that's going to have, and for productive issues, since certain relevant data of clinical importance will be there. So not thinking just about this case of use, but thinking of others, it needs to also have other decisions and features of security or to protect certain resources that have to do with access control. Just that. Thank you, Alejandro. Mauricio, I think you raised your hand. Yes, thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Marcelo. Very good presentation. My question actually has to do on whether there is a certain documentation of a real case of use. If you have like an implementation that we could take a look at, or the documentation of a process or partial that could have resulted in a real data in a productive setting. Go ahead, Fernando, or Marcel. I don't know. Go ahead, Marcel. Sure, go ahead. Okay. The implementation about the implementation, yes, there are cases. I cannot think of one that comes to my mind right now, but I can think of the registration of some here in Chile. I did not partake from that. I think Alejandro, Jose Maria, and my colleagues were part of it, and Pablo Pizarro, I believe. So I think that there are very positive differences with that implementation. And there's the project of Colombia, as Fernando said. I think Fernando was going to mention the Colombian project. And we explained it on the first session service, that you always think you're going to start from scratch, but there are certain cases that already have a certain database, either with existing accounts, or there's some of the things that can't see directly into Fire. So what we usually do is, with this presentation Marcelo has been giving about the repository, is that there are other ways to implement the repository, and that is an internal transformation and to inquire into a database with the given structure. And then finally, it's the same if you have the data stored, but what's important is that at the time of exchanging it, it's done in a standard manner, and that's like the criteria we should get to.
Sí, hola. Compartí las guías que
I
hicimos
I
en
just
Colombia.
shared in the chat the guides of what we did in Colombia, inspired in the HTML. We took some resources, the list at its time, and all together with the document references, and it saves a composition resource, which is the one here in Colombia called the RDA. So those guides
Están ahí en esa URL que
are
les
there in
compartí.
that URL that we
Y el
just
otro
shared.
servidor Vulcano
And the other
es el
server,
servidor de test
Volcano,
que
is a
utilizamos
test
acá en
server
la Conectathon
we use in the Connectathon to be able to prepare the technical teams and also the team that are going to support all this.
¿Alguna otra duda, consulta,
Any
pregunta?
other question or comment you'd like to make?
Bueno, si no hay ninguna otra consulta,
So if there are no more questions, please, if you can think of any questions right now, do send us on the go. And if there's any information you have or questions you may have. So today's material has been recorded so that it can also be used as a tutorial along with all the guides and what it's been, and it will be published shortly. The presentations are ready and we're working also with videos. So we want to thank all our attendees. Please don't hesitate to reach us out for any questions, any requirement, or whatever needs you may have on this. Thank you, Marcelo, our speaker for today, and we'll be seeing you next time. Have a great weekend. Thank you all for your time, and we'll see you next time.